It's my money. I earned it while you were sleeping, so why are you acting like a thief?
I sat there, holding the thin stack of paper that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I looked at my husband, the man who let me pay for his meals and his car, and asked him if he had anything to say about the $1.8 million listed on our tax return. He didn't even flinch. He just leaned back, crossed his arms, and said, "It's my money. I earned it while you were sleeping, so why are you acting like a thief?" The room went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming, and for the first time in 4 years, I finally saw him for who he really was. For 4 years, I believed I was married to a struggling immigrant student. I worked 12-hour shifts as a medical tech, survived on coffee, and even bought him his first car with my meager savings. I didn't mind. I thought we were a team. He even charged me $500 in rent every single month, claiming we needed to save for our future. But when I applied for a loan to buy a small house for my mother, the bank asked for our joint tax returns. That's when the lie shattered. My husband wasn't struggling. He was a millionaire. He earned $1.8 million last year alone, while I was struggling to pay for groceries. If you found out your partner was hiding a literal fortune while watching you struggle, what would you do? If you were in my shoes, what would you do? Type 1 or A if you would take the G-Wagon and try to make the marriage work for the money. Type 2 or B if you would file for divorce immediately and take half of that hidden fortune. Leave your comment below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now, because what happened when I called my lawyer will change everything. I came home at 8 p.m., the smell of hospital antiseptic still clinging to my scrubs. My feet ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm after 12 hours on the floor. But I didn't sit down. I couldn't. I had a printout from the bank sitting on the kitchen island, and it represented the only thing I wanted in this world. A small 2-bedroom house for my mother. She had worked her entire life to keep me afloat, and now, at 26, earning $20 an hour as a medical technician, I was finally ready to return the favor. Or so I thought. The kitchen was quiet, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. My husband, the man I had supported through 4 years of his struggling immigrant journey, was in the living room. I could see the glow of his laptop screen reflecting off his glasses. He looked ambitious. He looked hard-working. He looked like the man I had fallen in love with when he had nothing but a student visa and a dream. "Hey," I said, my voice steady despite the exhaustion. "The bank got back to me about the mortgage for Mom's place. They need our joint tax returns from the last 3 years to finalize the debt-to-income ratio." I watched him. I didn't look away. He didn't move for a long 3 seconds. Then he slowly closed his laptop, not a slam, just a soft, deliberate click. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "I told you I'd handle the financing," he said. His voice was smooth, devoid of any stress. "My bank has better rates anyway. Why are you rushing this?" "I'm not rushing," I replied. I walked over to the counter and picked up my glass of water. My hands were perfectly still. "I've already locked in the deal. The house is perfect. I just need the PDFs. It takes 2 minutes to email them." He stood up and walked toward me. He was wearing a designer hoodie I had bought him for his birthday, a gift that cost me 3 days of overtime. "It's complicated, honey. I've been doing some freelance consulting through an LLC. The taxes are messy. Let me talk to your loan officer tomorrow. I'll straighten it out." I took a sip of water. The cold liquid felt sharp against my throat. "There's nothing to straighten out. They just need the documents we filed. Why are you being so vague?" He let out a short, dry laugh and stepped closer, invading my personal space just enough to be intimidating. "I'm not being vague. I'm being protective. You don't understand how these tech contracts work. Just drop it. I'll take care of the bank." I looked at him, really looked at him. For 2 years of marriage, I had paid him $500 in rent every single month because the house we lived in was in his name only. I had bought his car. I had paid for our groceries when he claimed his startup wasn't liquid yet. And now, he was refusing to show me a simple tax return. "I'm not dropping it," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. I need those returns tonight, or I'm calling the IRS myself to request the transcripts. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, 1, 2, 3 times, before he finally blinked. The mask of the supportive, struggling husband didn't slip, but it tightened. He knew I wasn't backing down. I met him on a Tuesday 4 years ago through a screen that promised connection in a city that felt like a void. At 22, I was already deep into the grind, my life measured in 12-hour blocks of heart monitors and lab results. He was 21, a student from overseas with a sharp jawline and eyes that seemed to burn with a quiet, desperate ambition. He spoke of his family's struggles back home with a vulnerability that bypassed my defenses. He was the classic underdog, intelligent, hard-working, and tragically underfunded. I didn't just fall in love with him, I fell in love with the idea of being the person who helped him succeed. The early years were a blur of double shifts and cheap takeout. I remember the smell of the hospital cafeteria, stale coffee and industrial floor wax becoming my natural perfume. My hands were often raw from constant scrubbing, and the skin under my eyes stayed a permanent shade of bruised violet. But I didn't care. When he would tell me about his grueling university projects or his fear of not making it in this country, I felt a surge of protective energy. I was the provider. I was the foundation. "I can't ask you for more," he would whisper, his voice thick with a carefully crafted shame as I handed him my credit card to pay for his textbooks. "We're a team," I would reply, my voice steady, my heart full of a misplaced sense of heroism. I believed every word. When he graduated and landed a job at a tech company, I celebrated as if I had won the lottery myself. He told me the starting salary was $60,000. In my world, that was a decent living, but in the city we lived in, it was modest. He claimed he was working from home, often locked in our spare bedroom for 14 hours a day. I would tiptoe past the door, bringing him sandwiches and quiet encouragement, while I prepared for another night at the hospital. Then came the house. 1 year after his graduation, he surprised me. He had bought a 3-bedroom suburban home, a $400,000 property entirely in his own name. He told me it was a special immigrant loan and that he had used every cent of his savings for the down payment. I was so proud of him that I didn't even stop to do the math. How does a man on $60,000 a year secure a mortgage for nearly $500,000 in less than 12 months? I was too tired to be suspicious. "Since I'm carrying the mortgage alone, it would help if you could contribute $500 a month for rent," he said one evening, his eyes never leaving his laptop. "It'll help us build a safety net." I agreed without a second thought. I was earning $20 an hour, paying off my own student loans, and still, I handed over that $500 every month like clockwork. I even bought him his first car, a beat-up 2007 Toyota that rattled every time it hit 40 miles per hour. I paid for the title, the insurance, and the repairs while he drove it to his low-paying tech job. I sat at the kitchen table now, the ghost of those memories playing in my head like a distorted film. The man standing across from me wasn't the struggling student I had nursed through his exams. He was a man who had watched me exhaust myself for years, a man who had accepted my meager wages while he sat on a secret. I looked at my bank statement on my phone. The balance was $3,000. I looked at him. He was wearing a watch that I now realized cost more than my car. The silence in the kitchen wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the sound of a predator waiting for its prey to stop twitching. "I was your wife, not your investor," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet cutting through the air like a blade. "But you treated me like a line item on a balance sheet." He didn't argue. He just adjusted his glasses and looked at me with a cold, clinical detachment that mirrored my own. Every first of the month, at exactly 8 a.m., my phone would vibrate on the nightstand with a clinical, persistent buzz. It was a calendar notification I had set myself, but it felt like a recurring tax on my soul. I would open my banking app, my thumb hovering over the screen, and authorize a transfer of exactly $500 to my husband's account. The memo line always read the same: rent. It was a transaction ID 4521, a digital record of my status in our marriage. I wasn't a partner. I was a tenant with benefits. I remember the day he presented the idea. We had just moved into the new house, the one he had bought in his name only. We were standing in the kitchen, the air still smelling of fresh white paint and bubble wrap. I was exhausted, having just finished a double shift where I'd assisted in 3 emergency intubations. My hands were shaking from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. "Since the mortgage is a heavy lift on my $60,000 salary," he had said, his voice as smooth as polished glass, "I think it's only fair you contribute $500 a month. It's well below market rate for this area. It'll help us keep the lights on while I build the LLC." I looked at the granite countertops and the stainless steel appliances. I didn't have my name on the deed, but I felt a sense of pride that we had made it this far. I thought I was helping a man who was drowning in ambition but lacking in capital. "Of course," I whispered, leaning against the counter, "whatever we need to do." For 2 years, that $500 left my account like clockwork. On a medical technician's salary of $20 an hour, $500 was not a small contribution. It was 25 hours of standing on my feet. It was 25 hours of blood draws, patient complaints, and the constant high-pitched whine of hospital machinery. It was my grocery budget. It was the money I should have been using to pay down my own student loans, which sat at a staggering $42,312. While I was on the front lines of the healthcare system, he was at home. He worked in the spare bedroom, which he had converted into a high-tech office. He sat in an ergonomic chair that cost $850, a business expense, he claimed, while I wore through the soles of my sneakers every 6 months. I would come home to find him staring at 3 different monitors, lines of code scrolling past his eyes like digital rain. "How was work?" I would ask, dropping my bag by the door. "Stressful," he'd sigh, never turning around. "The market is tight. I'm barely keeping the LLC afloat. Did you remember to transfer the rent? The mortgage autopay hits tomorrow." I never questioned him. I felt guilty for even thinking about the disparity in our lifestyles. I told myself that his stress was intellectual and therefore more taxing than my physical labor. I treated his career like a fragile glass sculpture that I had to protect at all costs. I even started taking on Saturday shifts, 16 hours of overtime, just to make sure I had a cushion in case he needed more. I looked at him now, standing in that same kitchen 2 years later. The $500 felt like a burning weight in my chest. I thought about the total. 24 months, $12,000, $12,000 I had handed over to a man who was quietly accumulating a fortune of $1.8 million. "You charged me rent," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the anger he probably expected. Anger is for the surprised. I was beyond surprise. I was calculating. "You sat in this house, watched me leave for 12-hour shifts at 4 a.m, and you waited for that notification to hit your phone." He didn't look away. "It taught you financial discipline. Besides, you were using the utilities. Why should I subsidize your life?" I looked at the digital clock on the oven. It was 8:45 p.m. In my head, I began to do the math. I wasn't just a wife. I was his most consistent, low-risk revenue stream. The clinical realization hit me harder than the betrayal itself. He didn't love me. He managed me. "I didn't just pay for the roof," I said, my eyes tracing the expensive molding on the ceiling. "I paid for the privilege of being lied to." 3 years ago, the air in our tiny apartment was thick with the scent of cheap ramen and my own exhaustion. I was staring at my bank balance on my laptop screen, $3,542. It was every cent I had managed to scrape together after a year of grueling overtime at the hospital. My eyes were burning, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my glasses as I checked the Craigslist ad one more time. "It's reliable," I had told him, my voice hushed, as if speaking too loudly would make the money vanish. "It's a 2007 Toyota Camry. The paint is peeling on the hood, but the engine is solid. $3,200 flat." I remember the way he looked at me then. He was sitting on our sagging sofa, a textbook open on his lap, the picture of a man burdened by the weight of his own potential and a lack of opportunity. He had sighed, a long, heavy sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "I can't let you do that," he'd whispered, his eyes downcast. "That's your emergency fund. I'll just keep taking the bus, it's fine. I'll just leave 2 hours early for my interviews." His shame was his most effective weapon. It made me feel powerful. It made me feel like his savior. I had reached across the table and taken his hand. His skin was smooth, while mine was calloused from handling heavy gurneys and medical equipment. "Don't be ridiculous," I'd said. "You need a car to get to those tech networking events. If you land one of those jobs, we'll be set. Think of it as an investment in us." I withdrew $3,200 in cash the next morning. I remember the weight of the envelope in my scrub pocket as I walked to the used car lot. The bills were crisp, $20 increments that represented hundreds of patients I'd prepped for surgery, thousands of blood vials I'd labeled, and endless nights where I'd slept in the hospital break room for 4 hours before starting another shift. I bought the car. I paid the $241 for the registration and the title transfer. I even paid for the first full tank of gas and an oil change that cost $68. When I handed him the keys, he hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. He told me I was the only person who had ever truly believed in him. I stood in our high-end kitchen now, 3 years later, and the memory felt like a physical sickness. My hands were steady as I leaned against the marble island, but my mind was moving at 1,000 miles an hour. I looked out the window at that same 2007 Toyota sitting in our driveway. It looked pathetic next to the house he had bought in secret. He had driven that car to interviews while his bank account was ballooning. He had let me pay for the new tires when the tread got dangerously thin. He had even complained about the cost of the insurance, money that came out of my check every month, claiming that every dollar counts while we were still starting out. "The Toyota," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the room like a scalpel. "The car I bought you with my savings. The one you've been driving for 3 years while you were earning 7 figures. He didn't blink. He just adjusted the sleeve of his designer hoodie. It was a good car. It was low profile. It didn't attract unwanted attention while I was finalizing the merger for the LLC. "Unwanted attention from who?" I asked, my voice rising only a fraction. "From me. You let me worry about the repair bills. You let me take extra shifts because you said the business expenses were eating up your $60,000 salary." I thought about the math. $1.8 million. He could have bought 500 of those Toyotas. He could have bought a fleet of luxury SUVs and never noticed the dent in his bank account. But instead, he chose to watch me struggle. He chose to let me feel the pride of providing for him, while he sat on a fortune that would have changed my mother's life instantly. "You performed poverty," I said, the words feeling cold and sharp in my mouth. "You put on a costume every morning. You drove that beater like it was a badge of honor, while you were hiding enough money to retire us both 10 times over." "I was being smart," he countered, his tone remaining clinical, almost bored. "Wealth is built by minimizing expenses. You wouldn't understand the mindset of a founder. You have an employee mindset. You think about spending, I think about accumulating." I looked at the clock. The seconds were ticking by with a dull, metallic thud. He wasn't just a liar. He was a sociopath who viewed my sacrifice as a minimized expense. The 12-hour shifts, the raw hands, the exhaustion. To him, it was just free capital. "I bought you that car because I loved you," I said, my voice dropping back to a flat, dangerous calm. "You kept it because it was a convenient lie." I realized then that the man I had married didn't exist. The struggling immigrant was a character he played to get free labor and a devoted fan. I wasn't his wife. I was his most cost-effective asset, and it was time to liquidate. My mother is 62 years old, and her hands are a map of every sacrifice she ever made for me. She spent 30 years scrubbing floors in office buildings after the sun went down, her knees clicking with every step, her back permanently arched from the weight of industrial vacuums. She never complained. Not once. When I graduated and became a medical technician, Her only request was that I take care of myself. But I had a different plan. I wanted to give her a front porch where she could sit and watch the world go by without having to clean up after it. For 18 months, I lived on protein shakes and hospital overtime. I tracked every penny. I had a spreadsheet titled The Matriarch Project, where I logged my progress toward a down payment. I found the perfect place in a quiet, low-cost area 3 hours away. It was a small, white-sided cottage with a blooming hydrangea bush and a kitchen that didn't feel like a closet. The price was $125,000. To me, it was a kingdom. To my mother, it was peace. The bank officer, a man named Marcus with a voice like sandpaper, had been patient with me. "You've got a solid work history," he'd told me over the phone. "But since you're married, the underwriting department requires joint tax returns for the last 3 years. We need to see the full household picture to finalize the debt-to-income ratio." I remember sitting in our living room that evening, looking at my husband while he scrolled through a tech news site on his high-end tablet. I felt a surge of nervous excitement. This was it. The moment I could finally tell my mother she was retiring. "Hey," I said, my voice soft but firm. "I found the house for Mom. The bank just needs our tax returns from the last 3 years. Can you pull the PDFs from your secure drive?" He didn't look up. The blue light from the tablet cast a ghostly glow over his features, making him look sharper, colder. "A house? Now? The market is volatile, honey. Why are you taking on more debt for your mother when we're still trying to get on our feet?" I felt a cold prickle of irritation at the phrase, "get on our feet." I was the one on my feet for 12 hours a day. He was sitting in an ergonomic chair. "It's not our debt," I replied, keeping my voice level. "I've saved the down payment myself. My salary covers the mortgage easily in that area. I just need the paperwork for the bank's protocol. It's a formality." He finally looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that wasn't ambition. It was calculation, a predatory stillness. "I don't like the idea of our private financial data being bounced around by a small-town mortgage broker. It's a security risk for my LLC." "A security risk?" I asked. I set my phone down on the coffee table. "It's a standard mortgage application. Everyone does it. Why are you making this difficult?" "I'm not making it difficult. I'm being professional," he said, his tone shifting into that clinical, condescending register he used when he wanted to end a conversation. "Tell the bank I'll handle the financing through my private contacts. I can probably get a better rate anyway. Don't send them anything yet." I stared at him. The refrigerator hummed in the background, a low, buzzing sound that suddenly felt incredibly loud. I realized then that every time I brought up my own goals, my mother's house, my student loans, my desire to finally put my name on a deed, he moved the goalposts. He turned a simple request into a complex, strategic issue that only he could solve. "I've already locked in the deal," I said. My heart rate stayed perfectly steady, but my mind was beginning to sharpen into a weapon. "The seller is waiting. The bank is waiting. I'm not playing games with private contacts. I need the returns tonight." He stood up, towering over me just enough to try and shift the power dynamic. "You're being emotional about this house. You're not thinking about the long-term tax implications of joint filing with my business structure. I'll talk to the bank tomorrow." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood up and walked to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. I knew then that there was something in those documents he was terrified for me to see. It wasn't about security. It wasn't about tax implications. It was about the curtain he had pulled over our entire marriage. I watched him go back to his tablet, his fingers moving with practiced ease. He thought he had managed me again. He thought a few corporate buzzwords and a bit of intimidation would send me back to my 12-hour shifts, quiet and compliant. But as I looked at the dark reflection of myself in the kitchen window, I realized the dream for my mother had just changed. It wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about finding out exactly how much my struggling husband had stolen from our life together. The air in the living room felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a massive storm. My husband sat across from me, his face a mask of practiced calm. He tried to use his favorite weapon, condescension. "You're being hysterical about a few pieces of paper," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "I've told you, the LLC's tax structure is complex. You wouldn't even know what you're looking at." "I know how to read a total income line," I replied. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply sat there with my hands folded in my lap, perfectly still. "Send the PDF to my email now, or I walk into the bank tomorrow and tell them my husband is refusing to provide legal financial documents for a joint application. Do you want that kind of red flag on your complex business?" He stared at me for a long beat. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes, calculating the risk of my defiance against the risk of his secret. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, each second feeling like a hammer blow. "Fine," he snapped, his composure finally fracturing just enough to show a sliver of irritation. "If you want to play forensic accountant, go ahead, but don't come crying to me when you realize how much work it is to manage real money." He opened his laptop and hit a few keys. The sound of his mouse clicking was the only thing breaking the suffocating silence. "If you were in my shoes, what would you do? Type 1 or A if you would take the G-Wagon and try to make the marriage work for the money. Type 2 or B if you would file for divorce immediately and take half of that hidden fortune. Leave your comment below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now, because what happened when I opened that file will change everything." My phone chimed, a sharp digital ping that echoed through the quiet house. I picked it up. My thumb was steady as I tapped the attachment. The file name was a string of random characters, but as the PDF rendered on my screen, the reality of my 4-year marriage crystallized into a single devastating number. I didn't look at him. I just looked at the line labeled Total Household Income. The PDF rendered slowly, the blue loading bar crawling across my phone screen like a digital parasite. My husband sat back in his chair, his arms crossed, watching me with a look of smug expectation. He probably thought the numbers would confuse me, that the complex tax codes of a tech LLC would be enough of a labyrinth to hide his tracks. He was wrong. I deal with medical data every day. I know how to find the one anomaly in a sea of statistics. I scrolled past the personal information and the standard deductions until I reached the line that mattered. Adjusted gross income, 11814 these and 212. I stared at the number. $1,814,212. I looked further down to the breakdown of contributions. My W-2 from the hospital was listed right there, $38,412. The room went deathly quiet. I could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of his high-end laptop fan and the sound of my own steady breathing. My heart rate stayed at exactly 60 beats per minute. I wasn't panicked. I was calculating. For 4 years, I had worked 12-hour shifts, often coming home with blood on my shoes and exhaustion in my marrow. I had paid him $500 in rent every month, $6,000 a year out of my $38,000 salary. I had bought his car. I had skipped vacations. I had even delayed my mother's dental surgery because we were saving for our future. All while he was clearing over $150,000 a month. $1.8 million, I said, my voice as flat as a heart rate monitor after a patient passes. I didn't look up from the screen. "You earned $1,800,000 last year." "It's not as much as it looks like," he said, his voice regaining its smooth corporate edge. "After taxes, reinvestment into the LLC, and overhead, the liquid cash is much lower. You don't understand how business scaling works." I finally looked at him. I didn't see my husband. I saw a stranger who had performed a 4-year-long play of poverty just to see how much labor he could extract from me for free. "I understand that $3,200 for your car was 10% of my annual income," I said, leaning forward into the cold light of the kitchen. "And I understand that while I was eating ramen to make sure your startup survived, you were sitting on more money than I would earn in 40 years of medical service." He shrugged, a small, dismissive movement of his shoulders. "I didn't ask you to do those things. You chose to be a team player. I just let you." The clinical realization hit me then. He hadn't just hidden the money. He had enjoyed watching me struggle for it. He had treated my sacrifice like a game of strategy, a way to minimize his own household overhead. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my phone. I simply closed the PDF and set the device face down on the marble counter. "The bank doesn't need to see this," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "But my lawyer certainly does." The word lawyer hung in the air between us like a frozen blade. I watched him closely. His eyes darted toward his laptop, then back to me, the clinical mask of the successful founder finally beginning to crack at the edges. He didn't scream. He didn't charge at me. Instead, he did something much more calculated. He let out a long, weary sigh and sank back into his ergonomic chair, rubbing his face with his hands as if he were the one who had been exhausted by years of 12-hour shifts. "You don't understand, honey," he said, his voice dropping into a low, mournful register. "The money, it's not there anymore. That tax return is a snapshot of a moment that has passed. Business at this level is volatile." I didn't move. I leaned against the cold marble of the kitchen island, feeling the smooth stone through my scrubs. Volatile? $1.8 million doesn't just evaporate in 12 months without a trace. Where is it? He looked up at me, his expression shifting into a pathetic display of honesty. "I sent most of it back home. My parents, they were in deep trouble. Medical bills, debts from the move, supporting my siblings. I had to take care of them first. And the rest? I reinvested it into a new venture that's currently in the red. The bank accounts are practically empty. I'm living off the credit lines of the LLC just to keep this house." It was a classic move. Deny the existence of the assets, then pivot to a noble cause. He was trying to use my own empathy against me, hoping I would feel guilty for asking for my share of a fortune he claimed he gave away to needy parents. I thought about the $500 I had transferred to him 3 weeks ago. I thought about the $3,000 currently sitting in my savings account, my entire life's work. Then I looked at the dual monitor setup on his desk, the high-end audio equipment, and the $300 bottle of scotch sitting on the sideboard that he claimed a client had gifted him. "You sent $1.8 million to your parents?" I asked. I kept my voice flat, devoid of any accusatory heat. "Through which bank? Wire transfers leave a digital footprint. Transaction IDs, SWIFT codes, currency exchange receipts. If the money is gone, you should have no problem showing me the transfer confirmations." He stiffened. The mournful husband act was replaced by a flash of genuine irritation. "Why are you interrogating me like I'm a criminal? I handled the family finances because you were too busy at the hospital to care. I made the decisions that needed to be made. If I told you I spent it on my family, that should be enough for you." "It's not enough," I said, "because while you were taking care of your family with millions, I was struggling to buy groceries for ours. I was buying your tires. I was paying you rent. You didn't just lie about the money. You stole the last 4 years of my life by making me believe we were struggling together." He stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sharp, jarring screech. "I was protecting you. If you knew how much was in those accounts, you would have stopped working. You would have become complacent. I wanted to keep that fire under you to make sure we both kept pushing." I stared at him. He actually believed his own lie. He viewed his financial abuse as a form of mentorship. To him, my exhaustion was a tool he used to keep me motivated. "My fire came from wanting to take care of my mother," I said, my voice as cold as the hospital morgue. "And you used that dream to keep me compliant while you built a wall of cash between us." I turned away from him and picked up my phone. I didn't need to see his empty bank statements. I knew the truth now. He hadn't sent that money anywhere. It was hidden in offshore accounts, shell companies, or secret trusts. But he had forgotten one thing. In this state, assets acquired during a marriage are community property, regardless of whose name is on the LLC. "I'm going to bed," I said, walking toward the stairs. "In the morning, I'm calling a forensic accountant. I suggest you find those transfer confirmations for your parents. You're going to need them when we get to discovery." I didn't look back to see the look on his face. I didn't need to. I could hear the silence of the room, a heavy, suffocating weight that told me he knew the game was finally over. The next morning, the house was filled with a sterile, artificial peace. The smell of high-end Arabica coffee drifted from the kitchen, a stark contrast to the burnt, hospital-grade caffeine I usually survived on. My husband wasn't hunched over his monitors. Instead, he was leaning against the marble island, 2 sets of keys resting on the counter next to a folder of real estate listings. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice dropping into a smooth, conciliatory tone. "We've both worked hard. Maybe I was too focused on the accumulation phase. I want to make things right. Let's not make this messy with lawyers who will just eat up our future." I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hands steady, my eyes tracking the movement of the keys. "Make things right? You spent 4 years watching me exhaust myself while you sat on a fortune. How do you fix that?" He pushed the first set of keys toward me. "I put a deposit down this morning, a Mercedes G-Wagon, matte black, full options, customized interior. It'll be delivered to the driveway by Friday. No more 2007 Toyotas. You deserve to look like the wife of a successful man." I looked at the keys. $150,000 peace offering. A shiny metal distraction designed to keep me from looking too closely at the other 1.6 million. "And my mother?" I asked, my voice flat. He opened the real estate folder. "I'll fund 50% of the house you found for her. Cash. We can close by the end of the month. I'll even handle the inspections and the title transfer. Consider it a thank you for the energy you've provided these last few years. You kept the home stable while I built the empire." I took a slow sip of the coffee. It was bitter. I looked at him, the man who thought he could buy my silence for exactly $900,000 and a German SUV. He was trying to settle out of court before the court even existed. He was calculating my value like a depreciating asset. "You think I'm worth $900,000? I said, the realization settling in my mind with clinical precision. "You think the thousands of meals I cooked, the endless emotional support I gave while you were stressed, and the 12-hour shifts I worked to pay your rent can be wiped away with a car and a partial house payment?" "It's a generous offer," he countered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Most women would kill for this. You'd have a luxury life, your mother would be safe, and we could keep our homely atmosphere intact. You help me grow, and I provide the lifestyle. It's a win-win." I set my cup down. The sound of the ceramic hitting the marble was sharp, like a gavel. I realized then that I was worth way more than a G-Wagon. I was the reason he could focus. I was the silence, the stability, and the free labor that allowed his LLC to flourish. Without my energy, he was just a man in an expensive chair with a growing list of legal liabilities. "You're right about one thing," I said, looking him dead in the eyes. "Communication works, and my communication to you is this. I'm not signing anything. I'm going to work a double shift. When I come back, I expect to see the full financial history of that LLC on this table. Not a car key, not a bribe. The truth." He didn't move. The smug winner's smirk he'd been wearing since I walked into the kitchen began to falter. He realized that for the first time in 4 years, I wasn't buying the character he was playing. I was the one holding the invoice. The delivery of the G-Wagon on Friday morning was a silent affair. I watched from the living room window as the matte black SUV was lowered from the transport truck. It was a beautiful machine, intimidating, expensive, and perfectly engineered. My husband stood on the driveway, his hands in his pockets, looking at the car as if it were a trophy he had won. He thought the transaction was complete. He thought he had bought back the 4 years of lies for the price of a luxury lease and a down payment on my mother's house. I didn't go outside to thank him. I didn't even smile. I sat at the kitchen table, which was now covered in 3 folders of documents I had printed that morning. My heart rate was a steady 62 beats per minute. I felt a strange, cold clarity. He walked back into the house, tossing the new keys onto the marble counter. "It's in the driveway," he said, his voice brimming with a newfound confidence. "The wires for your mom's house are scheduled for Monday morning. We're good now, right? We can get back to being a team." "I hired a forensic accountant yesterday," I said. The words were quiet, but they hit the room like a physical weight. He froze. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a twitch in his jaw. You did what? I just spent $200,000 this morning to settle this. Why are you dragging this out? I'm not dragging it out, I replied, standing up slowly. I walked over to the folders. I'm auditing it. You told me you were worth $1.8 million. My accountant found the merger documents for your LLC from last quarter. You didn't just scale a startup. You sold a proprietary software package. The total acquisition was $4,200,000. I looked at him. The silence was absolute. I could hear the hum of the high-end appliances he had bought to fill the house he'd hidden from me. You offered me $900,000 and a car, I continued, my voice remaining perfectly flat. You were trying to buy my silence for less than 25% of the marital assets. You calculated my energy and my homely atmosphere and decided they were worth a discount. I was protecting the capital, he hissed, his face finally draining of color. If I give you half, the business loses its liquidity. I'm building a legacy. You were building a fortress, I corrected him, and you used my 12-hour shifts as the mortar. You charged me rent while you were sitting on $4 million. That isn't a legacy. That's a pathology. I picked up my bag. I had already packed a suitcase and left it in my 2007 Toyota, the car I had paid for with my own sweat. I didn't want the G-Wagon. I didn't want the peace offering. I wanted the court-ordered 50% of every dollar he had hoarded while I was scrubbing in for surgery. The papers will be served at your office on Monday, I said. I walked past him toward the door. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sadness. I felt the immense relief of a person who has finally stopped carrying a weight that wasn't theirs to bear. I drove to my mother's apartment in the old Toyota. It rattled and the AC was weak, but for the first time in years, the air felt clean. I had realized something in that kitchen. Wealth doesn't change people. It just gives them a bigger stage to show who they've always been. He was a man who valued accumulation over partnership, and I was a woman who was finally done subsidizing his greed.